Hey everybody, Desconquer here. So today I thought I'd talk about something that all new motorcycle riders take for granted, and that is radial tires. Now, because I'm pretty well as old as dirt and half as smart, I was actually there when radial tires were first introduced into racing. Now, let's just back up a little bit, and prior to radial tires we had bias ply tires, which have been around for like 60-70 years, and they worked pretty good, but you know, there was a lot of issues with them for long life and flexibility and wear and whatnot. And like all technologies, things are improved, and eventually we ended up with radial tires on cars. But getting them to work on motorcycles, because radial tires put a lot of side flex on a chassis, and motorcycles don't handle side flex very well. So it actually took a long time for the tire manufacturers to actually figure out how to put radial tires on a motorcycle and make them work properly. Now, I don't want to give anybody the impression I was the first guy to ride radial tires. I don't think I was the 1,000th guy to ride radial tires, probably the 10,000th. But what happened was, like all technologies, it usually begins in racing, and the factory racers, you know, were the first to actually switch over to radial tires. And eventually, as they were being perfected and improved in manufacturing and in construction, they became eventually available for other classes. And eventually what happened was the tires became sort of a tire that most racers were either able to purchase or were supplied. Now, what happened generally is that you have a tester who tests the tires, and then a race tester who, you know, for the particular race bike that tests them, and then eventually they end up in the hands of the top racers on the track. And then usually, you know, what the top racer had, you know, either a few weeks to a few months later, the other racers would get. And that's generally how the line of progression goes. And then what happens, those tires start being available for other classes. As they take a tire that, say, worked in 500 Grand Prix, and it comes eventually something similar to it or exactly like it comes to 250, then eventually 125. And of course, back then when I was racing, there was also an 80cc class. So, and these things were extensively used in racing, and it was actually a long time before they started showing up on street bikes. So the racers were probably using radial tires, I would say, exclusively for around 5 years before they ever saw a street bike coming from the factory with radial tires. Now, a lot of that had to do with when radial tires first came out, they hadn't this set on what the proper rim size and rim width was that bikes would be using. When I first started racing, radial tires were available on 18-inch wheels, which was not a big deal, but then they decided that they had to go to 17-inch wheels, and then they decided they had to go to a 17-inch wheel that was a certain width. So, you know, if you had tons of money, it's not a big deal spending a couple grand on a new set of rims, but a lot of racers don't have money. Like, you have a hard time being able to afford the tires for the weekend, let alone having to buy a new set of rims midway through the season. So I distinctly remember the first time I actually got a set of radial tires, because basically all the knowledge that we had built up over the years, that, you know, the race mechanics and the long-term tuners and whatnot had known about bias ply tires, pretty much went out the window, because we were all starting from scratch. And it was kind of interesting for the first couple months, because things that, okay, this isn't working while we do this. Well, on a radial tire, it was not working that way. In fact, some of the things were actually catastrophically bad that we used to do on bi-ply tires. So it was a lot of trial and error, and eventually what happened was the Radial Tires sort of settled in, and the manufacturers were then starting to work on you know, the rubber compounds, which, you know, you're seeing today with the tires that have a harder wear center than on the side, so you actually get better wear when you're vertically, but you still get really good side grip when you're leaned over. That was actually just coming into being as I was getting out of racing, so I never really saw a set of those tires. You can buy them on the street now, but when I was racing, those were like the you know, the golden ticket from Willy Wonka. Now, the interesting part was, at the time when I was racing, there was two tire manufacturers. We had Michelin and we had Dunlop, and it was interesting to see we had some racers that absolutely loved the Dunlops because they would slide, and they would actually slide very predictably, and they were if you were the type of rider that actually liked to, you know, slide your bike all over the place into corners and whatnot, they were for you. Now the Michelin tires didn't really slide as easily. They were not as predictable. They would slide, but they just weren't as easily to do it as you got with the Dunlops. But the difference was with the Michelins, when you started to slide them, the Michelins actually gave you pretty good feedback when you were actually getting to the limit. The Dunlops, you would slide, then you crash. The Michelins, you know, you get into a corner, you start to slide the tires, and you know, you start to slide, and then you could actually feel the bike starting to lose traction when you were getting close to the limit, so that you knew to back off. So for the first couple of years, you know, we had some very fast guys on Dunlops, but a lot of the faster guys who didn't crash were on Dunlops. Or sorry, the faster guys who would tend to crash a lot were on Dunlops, but the fast guys who tended not to crash as often were on Michelins. And I do remember, I believe it was our second or third season on radios, there was a problem with the Michelin plant, and all of a sudden we couldn't get tires. I don't know exactly what happened. Again, this is before Al Gore had invented the internet, so there was no real way of finding out. You know, you talk to 10 different people, you get 10 different answers. So we just, for half a season, we never got Michelin tires, so I was actually on Dunlops, and it didn't. I didn't get along good with Dunlops. I could never actually figure out exactly how far the limit was. I was still riding as fast as I was on the Michelins. It's just the comfort level wasn't there. And when Michelin became available, when the Michelin tires became available again, I was very quickly back on those tires. Now, of course, nowadays, if you watch all the racing, you see the tires literally change from weekend to weekend, and in some cases they have a tire on Friday and it's not working, and they fly in a new set of tires for Saturday and Sunday. But that's the you know, the difference from what it was from the late 80s. Now on the street, actually I'm trying to think, the first bike I actually had that came with radial tires was this one here, my RC51, because every bike I had prior to that, they were still on bias-ply tires when they came from the factories. Now the nice thing was some of the bikes I've owned, you could actually fit radial tires for them, because they actually within spec, but the factory didn't install them at the time. A lot of it had to do with, you know, liability and, you know, just not wanting to be the first out there with a new product that would possibly be catastrophic to your motorcycle company. But nowadays you're seeing, you know, radial tires on everything, and it's not a big deal. But, you know, I remember when those things first came out, and they literally were like, you know, witchcraft, because we couldn't figure out how something with such a flimsy little sidewall could actually work so well, but they did. On a little side note, probably the worst thing about radial tires when they first came out was trying to get them mounted on the rims, because the carcass of the tire, the tread part, was fairly stiff, but the sidewalls weren't. So when you put them on the rim, they wouldn't necessarily sit on the bead so you could inflate them. And for the first couple of years, you know, if you're in the pits and you heard a lot of cursing and swearing, it was probably because one of the mechanics was trying to put a new set of tires on a rim. And we had a whole bunch of different things that guys were doing. The common thing, what we would do is we'd put the tire on the rim, and then put motorcycle tie down right around the circumference of the tire, and tighten it down as possibly as hard as we could to compress it, so that the bead would the edge of the tire actually would get forced on the bead. And when you inflated it, it actually would pop on the bead. And of course, once it actually was set on the bead, you could take the strap off and inflate it properly. But that was probably the only thing I remember that was just funky about the radial tires. So if you ever run across an old racer, you should actually thank them, because we were sort of the crash test dummies of our era. We were a lot of the guys trying a lot of new stuff that everybody sort of takes for granted nowadays. So, anyways, have a good day and ride safe. Talk to you later.